gender, Shapiro hates black, Shapiro hates women. All of this is nonsense. Nothing I have said anywhere in here either has an ounce of animus or is intended to generate an ounce of animus. Right? We're all trying to solve problems together in American society. That means looking at the facts ourselves. It means looking at the facts and having discussions about them. If we can't do that, it's not even worth us talking. We may as well appoint some sort of oligarchic clique to govern us. If we're going to govern ourselves, we're going to have discussions with one another, and that means getting past the central point that we are not all evil. We're actually brethren in arms. We live in the freest, most prosperous country in the history of the world. The only way it's going to stay that way is if we recognize that we're brothers and not enemies. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. So as I say, the rule is that hands up and you go to the front of the line if you disagree.
Hello, everyone. We ask that you don't ramble and make your questions short and sweet. Please ask one question and keep the discussion civil. Thank you for coming tonight, everyone.
Well, glad I answered all your life questions, guys. We can do anything. It doesn't have to be on the topic of the speech. I'll even do dating advice, although you have been warned.
Hi. I have an environmental class in my high school. We just got done with our global warming unit, and we were talking about the alternative energy sources. And I was always asking my teacher, if we did go over to mostly renewable sources, what would the economic effect have on it? What would be your opinion on that?
Well, obviously, we have a carbon-based economy. Oil is extraordinarily efficient. Natural gas is extraordinarily efficient. Coal is relatively efficient. All of these are more efficient than solar and wind power. And so if by totally renewable energy we're talking about solar and wind, those technologies are simply not ready for the road. You can have Teslas that are based on electricity, and those seem like those are getting close to market, but they're also really, really expensive, and they run out of power after about 300 miles or so. All of that said, would I like to see movement toward renewable energy? Sure. I mean, I think everybody would. It pollutes less. You don't have to worry as much about the environmental consequences. But, I mean, estimates show that if you were to immediately outlaw, for example, all gas, you would cripple the economy. The economy would be done. I mean, we'd be a third world country virtually overnight if you were to do that. So you can't do it that way. Fortunately, we have this mechanism called the economy in which efficient methods of energy generate higher profits. And that's why you're seeing a movement toward more efficient fuel models. And this has been true in cars since the 1970s. Right, lighter, more fuel-efficient cars have been dominating the road recently. As oil prices rise, that's going to be truer and truer, and the environment is getting better. Now, I'm not somebody who's against all environmental regulation, by the way, because I believe that things that generate externalities can be regulated. But I do think that we have to take into account whether the effectiveness of a particular regulation is going to be useful or whether it's just a way for us to make ourselves feel better. And I think we have to look at that on a regulation-by-regulation basis.
Thank you. And I was just wondering if you'd be able to sign my book for me real quick.
Come on over to the front of the stage and I'll do it for you.
If you were to become president or an advisor to the president, what would you do to lower or reduce the national debt?
Well, so those are two different questions. If I were president, the first thing that I would do is eliminate a bevy of departments on the federal level. I'd get rid of the Department of Education. I would get rid of the Department of Energy. I would get rid of the EPA. I think all of these things can be fulfilled by actual legislation, right? The big problem is that you have enormous bureaucracies that employ literally millions of people and that cost an enormous amount of money, and Congress right now has an incentive to kick all the lawmaking power over to the regulatory bodies, and those regulatory bodies have no incentive not to spend enormous amounts of public money. The reality is, though, that cutting those departments won't make a difference. The first thing you have to do is privatize Social Security and restructure Medicare and Medicaid. Right? Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid represent 66% of the federal budget every year. They are the main drivers of America's national debt. And so anything else is just trimming around the edges. When we talk about cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, it ain't going to do it. There just isn't enough waste, fraud, and abuse to fill in that gap. So, by the way, Social Security, I mean, that's something everybody in this room should be for, restructuring of Social Security. You guys aren't seeing a buck. Okay, I'm not seeing a buck either. I'm never seeing that money again. That money is down a rat hole. Okay, you're paying that money in, it ain't coming out. The only way you're ever going to get that money back is if we have a system whereby we guarantee the Social Security payments of everybody, say, above the age of 55, but we start to transition people on an age-rolling basis toward privatization, guaranteeing a percentage of Social Security, plus you can now pay less tax and put your money into the stock market, for example, invest your own money. That's the only way that you're going to cure that problem. And Medicaid and Medicare seem to me should be done on a state basis, not on a federal basis. I'm not sure why the federal government is involved in those programs to begin with. These are not in the purview of the Constitution of the United States. If I were an advisor to the president, the first thing I would tell him is, Mr. President, put down that phone.
Quick follow-up. Would you consider cutting defense spending at all?
So the answer is yes, but it depends on line by line. I'd actually have to go through the defense, but I'm not one of these people who thinks that we need golden toilets, in the Department of Defense. But that said, defense is a legitimate function of the federal government. I think that there are a lot of functions the federal government is currently performing that are certainly not within its constitutional purview.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. My name's Mary, and I'm a huge fan.
Thank you.
My question concerns my future career choices. I hope to study political science and history, get a doctorate degree, and teach at a university. But I'm scared that being a conservative will make me a target. And do you have any advice to help me be successful in that career?
Yes. So my friend Dennis Prager and I have two very different views on this. My view is that you as an individual have to make a decision about how successful you want to be in that career and how long you can wait to actually say what you think. Because there's no question that if you were to write a historical paper on the fascist roots of gun control, that this would be very difficult to get by a PhD advisor for a dissertation. So you are going to have to wade through an enormous amount of manure in order to get to the roses. And I, by the way, I don't soft pedal that. I don't. There are a lot of people who will say, well, you should just stand up and say what you think anyway. Yeah, except then they shut down your career. Nobody ever hears about it, and you spend the rest of your life wondering what if. So my view is that you should say exactly what professors want you to say until you get their degree, and then you should become rich and famous and then say what you want. This was my actual strategy at UCLA. When I went to UCLA undergrad. When I was there, I wrote in Blue Books. Blue Books, I don't know if you guys still have Blue Books. You write anonymously in your Blue Books? Yes. Okay, so Blue Books are the greatest things that ever were because they can't tell who's writing them. So I would mouth off as much as possible in class, and then in my Blue Books I'd write like Bernie Sanders, and that's how you graduate summa cum laude from UCLA in political science. And then that gets you into Harvard Law School, and now they can't say you're stupid because you went to all their top institutions. So it's a method that I highly recommend.
Thank you so much.
I have a question about Edward Snowden and the NSA.
Mm-hmm.
In your opinion, was he a hero or a traitor, and why?
So he is a traitor who also revealed valuable information to the public. Both things can be true at once. So he's a traitor in that he was pretty obviously working as an agent of the Russian government. I mean, he ended up fleeing to Russia and hanging out there and being sponsored by the Russian government in a lot of this stuff. That said, is it important that the American people know that the federal government is gathering massive amounts of metadata? Sure. I just think that he went about it all wrong. If you want to leak it to the American press, you leak it to the American press, and then you take the consequences of that. But he didn't, right? He fled to Russia, and he decided to stay there, and he decided to release all of this information in bulk rather than even bothering to redact the portions that were most harmful to national security, which isn't the mark of a really responsible actor. So am I glad that we know more about the PRISM system? Yes, I'm very glad we know more about the PRISM system. Is that something we should have known more about before, the misuses of the Patriot Act surveillance system? Absolutely. Is he also somebody who I would trust with America's national security? Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us this evening. I hope you're enjoying your time on our campus. I want to take on the transgender issue, of
Sure.
course, because it's got to be treated. So one of the helpful distinctions you've made is how you differentiate public and private responses to individuals who are transgender. And you talked about that this evening briefly when you talk about people who publicly demand that they be referred to by a certain name or certain pronoun. My question is about the private context. And I've seen you allude to this a little, but I'm curious what your take is on this. If you and I were next door neighbors and I came by and said that while a biological man, I'm going to now be living as a woman, and I'm going to use a female name, and I'm going to live as a woman, and just telling you this as your next door neighbor and as your friend, that's a different context. And so I'm curious, what do you think is the appropriate way as you and I as private individuals to interact in that sort of situation?
So I think that whatever would reduce friction as neighbors would probably be useful. So number one, I am not, so I've always said that I am happy to use people's preferred name, but not pronoun. And that goes for public as well as private. So meaning, here's the good news about the English language. If you and I are speaking, I get to address you in second person, which is exactly the same whether you're male or female. So it really is not an issue. If you wish to call yourself, Bertha, then I will call you Bertha because you can change your name in the United States, right? That's something you can do, and names are names. That is not an objective statement about your biology. If, however, you wish me to refer to you as a woman, which presumably would be to a third party or something, that's something that I'm not willing to do, unless it were just, if it were the two of us privately, for example, and we were just having dinner together, and you want to be called that, for the sake of avoiding conflict, I probably would do that. But if we're, as you say, if we're talking in public and we're talking about the general public policy issue of whether this is something that all of American society ought to embrace, the idea that you're a woman, there's a difference between me humoring you for the sake of good conversation and me actually believing things. Right? Friends routinely elide facts about one another. And this would be another one of those cases if you and I lived next door to each other, I think.
Thank you.
You said you believe that after age 18, an individual can decide whatever they want to do with their body in reference to transgenders. Do you also believe that individuals should be able to commit self-harm and or suicide without being institutionalized? If not, then how are they different?
Okay, so the question of institutionalization is whether you are capable of even living a particular life and whether you're in control of yourself. So this is actually it's actually a fantastic question. What I would say is that the evidence that you are reducing your likelihood to live through transgender surgery is nil. Right? I don't see any evidence that the rates of suicide go up after transgender surgery. What I do see is that the rate of suicide goes up after suicide, or after suicide attempts. So your rates of death do go up after that. So if we as a society have an obligation to prevent you from self-harm, one of the things that's not clear is whether transgender surgery is actually self-harm or not. Right? The data on that it's actually relatively mixed because it doesn't seem to have much of an impact either way with regard to suicidality. And whether I consider it self-harm or not, if you're not actively killing yourself, I'm not sure that I put it in the same basket as, anything else. I think that, from personal perspective, I think tattoos are self-harm, right? I wouldn't tattoo myself. I wouldn't have my kids get a tattoo. But I think there are plenty of things in American life we're allowed to do that are not actually reducing your likelihood to live. Transgender surgery, I think, falls closer to that category in my personal political philosophy than it does to suicide.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Announcing yourself with authority.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So some of my family members have started going through the process of applying to colleges and actually moving in to colleges. So in my mindset, without being overbearing, how would I help them avoid some of this far left or far right rhetoric?
So, I think that if you're looking for sources of information, then I have a reading list that I've been working on for the last 2.5 years, basically, on my podcast, where I recommend something every single day. But what I would say is that you have to address it issue by issue. So most people are not interested in reading giant philosophical canon works by Plato, Aristotle, any of this. What they are interested in are quick answers. And fortunately, there are a lot of resources for that. So if they're discussing an issue, then it's a high likelihood you're going to be able to find a good video on it from Prager University or from me or from Jordan Peterson or from Sam Harris, who's not even right-wing, but I think is an interesting thinker. There's a bevy of material you can find online. All I would recommend is that you keep it short and sweet, because you have to balance out the efficacy of the information with the amount of information contained, right? You can't send somebody an hour-long lecture about global warming when all they want is a 5-minute answer.
Right. Could I get a book signed too?
Sure, come on. Yeah. Go for it.
Test. Hi, Mr. Shapiro.
Howdy.
I'm actually the president of the College Democrats here.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for co-sponsoring. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
Now, quick question. Are you the guy who protested me outside, or are you the guy?
We were having a bake sale, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's...
Well, were the cookies good, at least?
Yep, great
okay, good.
cookies.
Fantastic. Were they legal?
Not yet. Give it time. So my question to you relates specifically to the transgender issue that you brought up during your speech. You cite the UCLA study and claim that it doesn't show in any way that suicide rates go down post-op. You say there's no evidence verifying this. However, during your speech...
I said there's mixed evidence. I said there's mixed evidence about the drop in suicide rate.
During your speech, I pulled up the study on my phone as well as a bevy of other studies, looking at research from the Karolinska Institute, from Berlin scientists. It actually seems to suggest, specifically the Berlin study, that suicide attempt rates drop from 26% to 3% in post-op treatment.
Right, so I've seen that study also. One of the problems with that particular study is it's not longitudinal. That study is only about 1 year after the surgery. And what the statistics tend to show, at least according to scientists on the other side, right, is that you have to wait 10 years to find out whether the surgery takes or not, essentially. That there is an adjustment period. That, of course, you're really enthused in the year after you get a surgery that you feel you've been needing your entire life, but there's a readjustment period that happens. So, for example, here's another longitudinal study. This is a cohort study from Sweden. It was released in 2011 and covered sex reassignment surgeries from 1973 to 2003. So it's a 30-year longitudinal study, and it found that transgender surgery recipients were still 19 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population, and found that, quote, sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism. Right, so as I say, there is mixed data. I'm not saying those studies don't exist. I'm saying I do find severe flaws in some of the studies that are cited. A lot of them are cited due to small sample size or not enough time in the longitudinal. Yeah, you can follow up. That's fine.
Thank you. But specifically regarding the UCLA study, it actually suggests that when people are in supportive environments, their suicide attempt rates go down. You said that you do not believe feeding into their, quote, delusion will support them. How do you respond to the UCLA study you yourself use, suggesting that it in fact does?
So a lot of these, so I don't tend to believe self-reported studies about treatment, meaning how people treat you. Questionnaire studies are not as good as behavioral studies. So the more important statistic from that study, the one that I usually cite, is the one about whether people can identify you as transsexual or as transgender or not. Right? If they can identify you as transgender, it's a 45% lifetime suicidality, suicide attempt rate. And if you are not identified as transgender, there's a 40% lifetime suicide attempt rate. Now, that doesn't mean that if people are mean to you, that your life isn't worse or that your suicide rate may not go up. Maybe it does. But I think that the evidence is not particularly strong on that score. And the level of bullying you have to really have some sort of third-party documentation as to the level of bullying, because there's also the significant possibility that people who are more likely to commit suicide are also more likely to feel sensitive to bullying that other people might not feel sensitive to.
Thank you for coming out. I hope you enjoy the weather.
Mr. Shapiro, given the recent Andrew McCabe firing and the FBI investigations in general, do we have, as the president seems to imply, an out-of-control FBI, bureaucratic mismanagement, Washington is normal, or a president that can't seem to leave well enough alone?
All of the above might be a possibility. I think that the short story is that government is filled with people. People suck. Okay, that's the really short story. And that means that there are some politically driven people, And there are some honest people, and there are some politically driven people who believe they're honest. And so do I think there was a giant conspiracy afoot inside the FBI to delegitimize the president in the run-up to the election? No. I don't think that. The reason I don't think that is because it makes no sense. Because, again, the initial investigation began in March 2016, not with the Carter Page FISA warrant, but with the investigation into George Papadopoulos. And also, I was there during the election cycle, and the FBI didn't leak all the information on the Trump investigation, but they were routinely discussing the Hillary investigation. So it's been amusing to watch as James Comey went from being a hero to Hillary fans, to being a villain to Hillary fans, back to being a hero to Hillary fans. Right? He's literally done that in a year and a half. It's pretty incredible. As far as Andrew McCabe, what I don't understand is how McCabe being fired has anything to do with, for example, the Mueller investigation. Now, let me be clear. I don't think there was any Trump-Russia collusion because I don't think Trump could collude with his right foot. I just don't think it's possible. Right? In order for Trump to be able to collude with things, he has to know what's going on around him. And I don't think that the president is well known for his organizational prowess, as you may have noticed in his staffing decisions of late. Right? This is not somebody who's sitting in the back room playing MAGA, 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 4D underwater, upside down, hungry, hungry hippos. Right? This is a guy who's flying by the seat of his pants, which, is his thing. But the suggestion, I know people who are in his campaign. In fact, I know the people who ran his campaign. And it was a shit show. I mean, I'm not going to, pardon the language, but the notion that they were organizing this every step of the way, and it was deep cover. They had some sort of a drop zone where they would drop documents for the Russians, and Putin would stop by with his documents and drop them back, and it was all Hillary's emails, and then they'd reveal them in the most organized possible fashion. In the middle of that election cycle, the President of the United States was caught on tape saying he wanted to grab women by their genitals. Okay, that's not how this campaign went. Okay, so again, I think Trump's his defense to this is very easy. Of course I didn't do this. Have you seen me? Right? Unfortunately, I think that he's so wrapped up in all of the hullabaloo about it that he's, I think, rightly angry and frustrated that he won't be cleared. Because I do think that there is, once you start a special counsel investigation, it goes all the way to the end. And what you're seeing from Trump right now can be read in one of two ways. If I were on the left, I would read this as Trump is obviously guilty of something and trying to cover it up. If I were on the right, which I am, I'd read this as Trump doesn't know what the hell he's doing and he's pissed and he's saying crap. Because that fits the profile more to me. Right? He's pissed off and he's saying crap. In fact, that may go on his headstone. Right? Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, he was pissed off and saying crap. Right? So, yeah, as far as the McCabe thing, do I think Mueller should be fired? No, I think Mueller should go ahead. I think we'll find out what Mueller has to say. I think in all likelihood it'll be weak tea, and then at the end, everybody will go back home and whine about it.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Shapiro, my question is directed towards the topic of gun rights and gun control. And with all the recent shootings and school shootings where most of the shooters were able to easily acquire a gun and ammunition in a gun store, I was just, as a fellow conservative and supporter of the Second Amendment, I'm just curious to know, do you believe that rather than outlying certain like assault rifles or bump stocks, do you believe there should be more of a enforcement of background checks and psychological exams to reduce probability of these people acquiring weapons, or you still believe that should be very few restrictions?
Well, I mean, there are universal background checks for all legally purchased firearms that are not hand-to-hand transfers in the United States, right? I mean, that is the federal law. If you buy from a federally licensed firearms dealer, you are going through a federal background check. The problem in the case of Parkland is that there were 1 million warnings about this guy, and the authorities did nothing. So this was not a lack of authority on the part of the authorities. This was a lack of performance on the part of the authorities. You saw the same thing in the Sutherland Springs shooting. You saw the same thing in Sandy Hook. You saw the same thing at Virginia Tech. There have been just a bevy of warnings about an enormous number of these folks, and the authorities didn't do what they were supposed to do, or the gun was obtained illegally, or if it was obtained legally, there's really no way to take a gun away from some of these folks, like the Las Vegas shooter. There's no real way to prevent him from buying guns without preventing 300 million Americans from buying guns. He didn't have a criminal record. There was no psychiatric history. So we still don't, I mean, it's amazing that we've just glossed right over the worst shooting in American history, and we still don't know what went on. I'm deeply suspicious that there was stuff going on there that we don't know about. The police department has not been forthcoming there. But again, the question is, how do you do this in terms of public policy? Do I think more background checks are going to make a difference? Not really. We have universal background checks in the state of California. It hasn't seemed to make much of a difference in the murder rate or in gun crime in the state of California. We've had mass shootings in the state of California, multiple in the last several years. The San Bernardino shooting happened just a couple of years ago. So Do I think that banning particular types of weapons is going to matter? I don't think that banning AR-15s is going to matter. I think that an AR-15 is just a rifle. It's a semi-automatic rifle. People who pretend the AR-15 is different in kind from other rifles doesn't know anything about a semi-automatic rifle. It is a normal semi-automatic rifle. Bump stocks could be seen as a slightly different thing. Machine guns have been illegal in the United States essentially since 1934, reiterated in 1987. They've been in short supply ever since. The problem with banning bump stocks is, again, I'm not sure how effective that's going to be, considering that you can essentially manufacture a bump stock with a spring and some plastic. But that said, there's a stronger case to ban bump stocks through regulation than there is to ban AR-15s. I don't see any legal case under the Second Amendment for banning AR-15s.
Okay, well, thank you.
This will be our last question due to time constraints.
Hey, Ben. Well, I was going to tell you about my friends over at Birch Gold, but they asked me to keep it short. So I am going to ask, in one of our classes recently, I'm a political science major, we were talking about legal realism and the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. And I had a question, as someone who does believe, who tends to believe a little more on the legal realistic side, how much legitimacy do you think we should present to the Supreme Court, given the fact that they're unelected officials who serve lifetime appointments and appear to be political actors at this point?
I mean, my answer is very little. I've never been a big fan of judicial review. In fact, I wrote my entire third-year thesis at Harvard Law School on why judicial review was never fully intended by the framers of the Constitution. So I've never been a believer that there should be this group of wise men who sit and women who sit at the upper level wearing black robes that make them special, declaring what is and is not constitutional. I think that every constitutional office in the United States requires you to swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, and virtually every question is a political question, doctrine question, meaning that the branches should basically slug it out with each other. I tend to be more of a legal realist as well. I think that legal realism, for people who don't know, is a basic philosophy that says that people tend to rule along the lines of their political preferences and then make up excuses afterward, which, again, I think is more true of people on the left of the court than on the right, but maybe that's because I'm on the right? I mean, the reason that I believe that is because there are more cases where Justice Scalia would have voted in favor of upholding a law that he personally disagreed with than cases where people on the left wing of the court vote in favor of upholding a law they disagree with. If Anthony Kennedy doesn't like a law, down it goes. If Scalia doesn't like a law, the question he asks himself is, does the legislature have the authority to make that law in the first place? So I'm not a full legal realist because I do think it's possible to interpret the Constitution properly, but I am sympathetic to the argument of legal realists insofar as it results in a centralization of power in one branch of the government above and beyond the other two branches of the American government, which I feel is more aristocratic and oligarchic than the founders intended.
Thank you. And if you ever fire Mathis, you can expect to see my resume on your desk.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it.